The hearing room was already tense, but Jim Jordan thrived on tension. Leaning forward, voice booming with the familiar cadence of confrontation, he cut into the proceedings with the swagger of a man who believed the room and the cameras belonged to him. He fired off legal terms like weapons, each syllable sharpened to intimidate, each interruption designed not to seek truth, but to dominate. The smirk that tugged at the corner of his mouth told the story. This was theater, and he believed he was the star. But then, in a moment that few expected, the air shifted. Jasmine Crockett, seated across from him, did not flinch. Her gaze was steady, her posture rooted, her expression the picture of calm authority. She waited, letting Jordan burn through his tirade, letting the echoes of his bluster settle into the wood-paneled chamber. And when the noise faded, when the performance reached its peak, she delivered words so precise, so sharp, that the room froze. "Congressman, you don't even understand the law you're trying to wield." The silence was instant, cutting through the hearing louder than Jordan's raised voice ever could. Staffers glanced at each other, reporters' pens hovered above notepads, and even the restless shuffle of feet in the gallery halted. Jordan blinked, his confidence cracking ever so slightly. The arrogance that had seemed untouchable met a wall of unshakable composure, and in that clash, the power in the room shifted. Body language told the story more than words. Jordan leaned back, shoulders stiff, searching for a retort that refused to come. Crockett remained forward, her tone even, her eyes unwavering, as if she'd been preparing for this very moment her entire career. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was an exposure, a public stripping away of bluster to reveal ignorance hiding beneath. Gasps rippled through the chamber, subtle but undeniable. A faint murmur broke out in the back rows, the kind that precedes a wave of reaction destined to spill far beyond those walls. Viewers at home would later replay this moment, frame by frame, savoring the exact instant when arrogance met truth, and truth refused to bow. But this wasn't just a clapback, it was the start of a public unraveling that no one saw coming. For those who had watched Jim Jordan over the years, the spectacle was nothing new. His reputation was built on interruption, on talking over colleagues, witnesses, and anyone who dared to challenge his authority. He thrived on noise, on rattling his opponents until they stumbled, on wielding legal jargon like a bludgeon rather than a scalpel. Every hearing became a stage, every exchange an audition for the evening news. He wasn't there to persuade. He was there to dominate. That day, he arrived armed with the same strategy: drown the room with volume, overwhelm with confidence, and leave his opponents struggling to find air. It was a style that played well with his base, a performance tailored for clips shared across partisan networks. And for years, it had worked. Witnesses hesitated, colleagues faltered, and time after time, Jordan walked away looking untouchable, at least in the eyes of those who cheered the performance. But hearings are not supposed to be theater. They are meant to embody the dignity of governance, the pursuit of truth, the checks and balances that form the backbone of democracy. Every raised voice chips away at that ideal. Every interruption sends a message: power matters more than fairness, intimidation more than facts. And on that day, the stakes were higher than Jordan realized. Because this wasn't just another shouting match. It was a test of what America values: bluster or clarity, arrogance or composure. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, and while her name might not have carried the same national weight at that moment, her presence told a different story. Unlike Jordan's swagger, her silence spoke louder than noise. She had no need for theatrics. She carried herself with the discipline of someone who had lived through struggle, who had seen firsthand what happens when those in power mistake intimidation for justice. She listened, eyes steady, body language unshaken, as Jordan layered one half-truth upon another. The cameras caught it all: the way she didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes, didn't meet arrogance with mockery. Instead, she embodied the patience of a lawyer who knows that facts outlast fury, that preparation outshines posturing. Every second she stayed composed, the contrast sharpened: one man loud, frantic, overbearing; one woman calm, rooted, unmovable. It was in that contrast that the stakes of the moment became clear. This wasn't simply a clash of personalities. It was a referendum on what power looks like in America. Would viewers see authority in the raised voice of a man who treated the law like a weapon? Or would they find dignity in the measured restraint of a woman who carried the law in her bones? The tension was more than personal. It rippled outward, into a broader cultural conversation. For every immigrant who had been talked over, for every citizen told their voice didn't matter, for every woman who had been dismissed in rooms dominated by men who mistook volume for substance, this moment was validation. Crockett was not just responding to Jordan. She was answering years of silencing, years of arrogance parading as knowledge. And though the room couldn't yet see it, the tide was beginning to turn. The same cameras that had so often amplified Jordan's bluster were about to capture something he couldn't control, his unraveling, live and undeniable. What happens next would rewrite the power dynamics in that room and beyond. To understand why Jim Jordan carried himself with such certainty that day, you have to step back and trace the arc of his career. From the very beginning, Jordan built his reputation not as a builder of coalitions, not as a quiet legislator working behind the scenes, but as a combatant. He thrived in conflict, positioning himself as the voice that would never bend, the attack dog unleashed when his party needed to rattle cages. His brand was clear, relentless, uncompromising, unyielding. In hearing after hearing, he perfected the same style, rapid-fire questioning, rhetorical traps, and a refusal to let opponents finish their thoughts. Witnesses often left sessions looking less like they had testified before Congress and more like they had been steamrolled by a force of will. For Jordan, domination was victory. He didn't need facts to be airtight, he needed the soundbite, the clip, the viral moment where he looked untouchable. And it worked at least for a time. He became the darling of conservative media, his raised voice echoing across television screens and social feeds. The chaos he created was spun as strength, the noise reframed as conviction. He branded himself as a defender of law and order, a warrior against corruption, a man who could not be silenced. But beneath the slogans and the grandstanding lay contradictions that grew harder to ignore. For a champion of law and order, his own history was not free from shadows. Allegations lingered from his time at Ohio State University, where questions about what he knew, and chose not to act on regarding abuse by a team doctor never fully went away. He denied them vehemently, but the whispers remained, nagging at the edges of his carefully constructed image. For a man who demanded accountability from others, his own evasions painted a starkly different picture. Then there was his role in the chaos surrounding the 2020 election and its aftermath. He raised questions, amplified conspiracies, and stood firm with those who sought to undermine the certification of results. For someone who claimed to defend the Constitution, he appeared ready to bend its spirit when it suited his side. The contradiction grew louder, a lawmaker who wielded law as a weapon, but who treated it as malleable when inconvenient. Yet none of this seemed to shake his confidence. If anything, it fueled it. Every controversy became another chance to show defiance, every headline another opportunity to paint himself as the embattled warrior, unfairly attacked by his enemies. To his supporters, he was a fighter. To his critics, he was a bully. And like many bullies, he mistook fear for respect, noise for power, and intimidation for truth. By the time he sat in that hearing room, Jordan believed he had mastered the formula. He had walked this path countless times, rattling witnesses and belittling colleagues, knowing the clip would end with his raised voice and his opponent's frustrated silence. He leaned on the certainty that no one could match his aggression, that sheer force of personality would carry the day. He saw hearings not as a search for answers but as a battlefield where only one voice deserved to be heard, his own. But arrogance blinds. Jordan had grown so accustomed to playing the aggressor that he could no longer see the cracks in his armor. His reliance on theatrics left him vulnerable to someone who refused to play the game. His overconfidence and intimidation left him unprepared for a calm, surgical dismantling. And his insistence on controlling the narrative left him open to the one thing he could not overpower, truth, spoken with clarity and conviction. That is why the moment carried such weight. Jordan entered that room convinced of his dominance, certain that he would once again leave with a clip showcasing his control. He was the villain who believed the script would always bend in his favor. He underestimated not just Jasmine Crockett, but the power of composure itself. And so, as he launched into his performance, unaware of the shift already underway, the stage was set. The cameras were rolling, the audience was watching, and the room was bracing for yet another Jordan spectacle. But what unfolded would not be his triumph. Because Jim Jordan had no idea the quiet force sitting across from him was about to dismantle his entire act. Before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in Congress, before the cameras and the headlines, she lived a life shaped by struggle, resilience, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Unlike many who treat politics as theater, her path was carved through the grit of real battles, courtrooms where the stakes weren't ratings, but lives. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett's childhood was not gilded with privilege. She saw firsthand the way communities like hers were too often ignored, written off, or worse treated as problems to be managed rather than people to be served. Those early experiences planted a fire in her. If the system would not bend toward fairness, she would dedicate her life to forcing it closer. Law school was not just a career choice. It was a declaration. For Crockett, the law was not a toy for political posturing but a tool for the vulnerable. She threw herself into civil rights work, representing clients who couldn't afford high-powered attorneys, standing up for those who had been silenced, and carrying the weight of cases that larger firms avoided. Many nights ended long after midnight, her paychecks modest compared to the hours poured in, but the work gave her something more valuable: conviction. She saw the system's cracks up close. Clients dismissed because of their race. Families broken by legal processes they barely understood. Ordinary people who lacked the language, the education, or the resources to fight back against injustice. Crockett became their voice, their shield, and often their last hope. Those experiences did not harden her, they refined her. They gave her composure, the calm of someone who has weathered storms bigger than a shouting congressman. Her rise into politics came not from ambition, but from necessity. She watched laws being written by people detached from the realities she saw in court every day. So she stepped into the arena, first in Texas, where she quickly gained a reputation as a fierce, principled fighter. She wasn't interested in politeness when people's rights were on the line. She didn't wait her turn in a system designed to silence outsiders. Instead, she spoke truth with a force that resonated far beyond party lines. It wasn't an easy road. She faced the whispers that so many women of color endure, that she was too loud, too emotional, too angry. But she refused to carry those labels. Her anger, when it showed, was righteous, not reckless. Her voice, when raised, was rooted in substance, not theatrics. And behind her fire lay an unshakable discipline, the same patience honed in courtrooms, the same resilience built from years of proving doubters wrong. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett had already faced battles tougher than partisan grandstanding. She had stood with clients who had nothing, who had lost everything, and fought until their dignity was restored. She had endured the smears, the dismissals, the attempts to box her in, and each time, she came back sharper. Where others saw obstacles, she saw preparation. Where others heard noise, she heard opportunity. This was what set her apart in that hearing room. To Jim Jordan, the clash was another performance, another chance to flex dominance through volume. To Jasmine Crockett, it was simply another test of endurance, another moment where patience and preparation would outweigh arrogance. Her calm that day was not accidental, it was earned through years of practice in far harsher arenas. And for millions watching, her presence carried something deeply personal. For the young woman told to sit down in meetings, she stood tall. For the immigrant family dismissed at City Hall, she refused to be ignored. For every underdog who had been silenced by someone louder, wealthier, or more entitled, she was proof that silence does not equal weakness, that composure can be more powerful than rage. Her authenticity was her armor. She did not posture, she did not mimic the theatrics of her opponents. She spoke in her own cadence, grounded in law and lived experience. It was this refusal to be anything but herself that made her relatable, magnetic, and unshakable. The audience watching progressive, immigrant-friendly, identity pride-driven saw in her not just a politician, but a reflection of themselves. And so, when Jim Jordan squared up with his usual confidence, believing the formula would play out as always, he was unknowingly walking into a storm he couldn't predict. For Crockett was not the kind of opponent who crumbled under volume. She was the kind who thrived in silence, who let arrogance dig its own grave, and then lowered the gavel with a single, undeniable truth. And when her moment came, every word struck like a gavel of justice. The chamber felt less like a hearing and more like a stage now, with every eye fixed on the duel unfolding between Jim Jordan and Jasmine Crockett. Jordan, sensing resistance, did what he always did: he pressed harder. His voice grew louder, his interruptions more frequent, each jab dripping with the certainty of a man who had never doubted the effectiveness of his own aggression. He leaned forward, finger jabbing the air as if the sheer force of his gesturing could turn half-truths into reality. "Congresswoman," he barked, "you clearly don't understand the law you're citing." The words carried not just arrogance, but condescension, meant to put Crockett in her place, to remind the room of who he believed held authority. But Jasmine Crockett was unmoved. She adjusted her microphone with deliberate calm, met his eyes without flinching, and spoke in measured tones. Her words were precise, her rhythm steady, like a surgeon making incisions with scalpel in hand. Where Jordan wielded volume, she wielded clarity. Where he aimed to overwhelm, she aimed to expose. And in that contrast, the tension grew thicker. The chamber began to buzz with unease. Staffers shuffled in their seats, the audience in the gallery leaned forward, and reporters sharpened their focus. The clash was no longer just about the issue at hand, it had become a symbolic battle. Jordan embodied the old playbook: dominate, intimidate, silence. Crockett represented a new counterforce: resist, endure, dismantle. As Jordan's voice climbed, so did his frustration. Crockett's refusal to rattle was like a mirror exposing his own weakness. He hurled accusations, cloaking them in legal jargon, but the words landed hollow. Crockett responded with surgical rebuttals, each reply calmer than the last, each correction more cutting than a raised voice could ever be. The chamber felt the imbalance beginning to tilt. Viewers at home would later describe it as watching a balloon swell with air, knowing it would burst, but not knowing exactly when. Jordan's performance had always thrived on the silence of others, but this time, silence was his undoing. It was not weakness, it was composure. And the more Crockett stayed composed, the more desperate he seemed to break her. "You don't even grasp the basics," he snapped, his voice echoing across the room. He slammed his papers on the desk, as if punctuation could make his argument stronger. But Crockett, unshaken, leaned slightly closer to her microphone and spoke as if addressing a jury, not a heckler. "Actually, Congressman, I grasp the law so well that I can see exactly how you're distorting it." The room reacted not with applause, not with overt cheering, but with something subtler: the sound of suppressed laughter, the sideways glances of colleagues, the recognition that Jordan's armor had a crack. For the first time, his certainty seemed performative, not genuine. But Jordan could not recognize it. He doubled down, as he always did, believing volume was victory. His words came faster, his tone sharper, his posture rigid. He was determined to win this exchange by sheer force, convinced the cameras would once again crown him the aggressor triumphant. To him, the script was inevitable: louder, faster, harder until the opponent folded. Yet the audience both in the chamber and across the country saw something else. They saw a woman absorbing the blows, redirecting the energy, and revealing the cracks in a man who had built his career on intimidation. They saw arrogance unraveling in real time, and patience standing taller than rage. The tension reached its peak. Jordan, red-faced and insistent, believed victory was only a few words away. Crockett, calm and centered, prepared for her strike. But his certainty would collapse in seconds. The chamber had reached its boiling point. Jim Jordan, flushed and animated, threw his final jab with the confidence of a man convinced he had landed a decisive blow. His voice thundered, you don't even understand the very law you're pretending to defend." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet, an open dare for Jasmine Crockett to stumble, to retreat, to fold beneath the weight of his practiced aggression. But Crockett didn't stumble. She didn't retreat. She didn't fold. She leaned forward into the microphone, and for a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a calm that sliced through the tension, she began. "Congressman Jordan," she said evenly, "what you just displayed is exactly why this body cannot afford to confuse volume with knowledge." A low ripple ran through the chamber. Jordan's shoulders stiffened. Crockett didn't stop. "You cite statutes as though they're weapons, but you consistently misquote, misframe, and misunderstand their very intent. The law is not a shield for your talking points, it's a framework built to protect every citizen, including those you've spent your career dismissing." She let that sink in. The reporter's pen scratched furiously. A few muffled chuckles escaped from the gallery. Jordan opened his mouth to cut in, but Crockett raised a single hand, palm flat against the desk, never breaking her gaze. "And since you're so confident," she continued, "let's be clear. The precedent you invoked just now, it does not say what you claim. In fact, it says the opposite. It affirms that due process cannot be bent to political convenience. I have read the case law. I have practiced it. I have lived it. And unlike you, Congressman, I don't confuse theater with jurisprudence." The chamber gasped. Jordan's face flushed deeper, his eyes darting from his notes to her and back again, searching for footing he no longer had. His weapon of intimidation had been stripped bare, exposed as hollow bluster. Crockett leaned back slightly, giving the moment room to breathe. Her cadence was flawless: attack, reveal, pause, reaction. Each line landed like a hammer striking steel. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. Jordan the aggressor now looked cornered, and Crockett the so-called underdog radiated unshakable control. She pressed forward. "You claim to defend law and order, but what you practice is disorder, weaponizing fragments of legal language to suit your ends while ignoring the Constitution's core, equality before the law. You wield power like a cudgel, but you forget, real power comes from understanding, not intimidation." From the back row came a stifled laugh. A staffer covered their mouth, pretending to cough. Even some colleagues who usually stayed poker-faced couldn't suppress small nods, as if acknowledging, silently but unmistakably, she had him. Jordan, unable to bear the silence, tried to jump in again, his voice higher now, faster, almost pleading. "That's not what I said." But Crockett's voice cut through, firmer than before. "Congressman, you don't get to rewrite the law on the fly. You don't get to bend precedent to fit your narrative. And you certainly don't get to silence those of us who came here not to perform, but to protect the people who sent us." The words landed with finality. There was no shouting to match it, no paper slam that could compete. The room had shifted fully, undeniably. Jordan's bluster shrank, his authority leaking away with every syllable she spoke. And beyond that room, the ripple began to form. Imagine the social media storm brewing, clips replayed in slow motion, captions flashing. She ended him. Tweets firing off in real time. Crockett just schooled Jordan on his own playbook. Instagram reels looping her words with bold text: "The law is not a shield for your talking points." Hashtags climbing, hashtag Crockett mic drop, hashtag Jordan exposed, hashtag truth over theatrics. In living rooms, college dorms, office break rooms, viewers leaned closer to their screens. Progressive communities celebrated the rare sight of bluster dismantled so cleanly. Immigrant families, watching a woman of color stand unshaken in the face of arrogance, felt a flicker of validation, of pride. Comments poured in: "This is why representation matters." Finally, someone who knows the law and isn't afraid to say it. She did what we've all wanted to do: shut down the noise with truth. Back in the chamber, Jordan sat rigid, the bravado slipping from his face. His jaw clenched, his eyes down for a flicker before darting back up, a telltale sign that the confidence was cracking. He shifted in his chair, grasping at papers as though the answers might be buried in ink. But no piece of paper could rescue him from the moment that was already etched into memory. Crockett closed with precision, her voice calm but ringing with authority. You can shout, you can distort, you can even believe that performance is power. But at the end of the day, Congressman, the law doesn't bend to arrogance. It demands integrity. And that's something you cannot fake. The silence that followed was seismic. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. The audience's breath caught. Even her colleagues on the dais sat straighter, eyes wide, as if realizing they had witnessed not just a rebuttal, but a shift in the balance of the room. Jordan tried to summon a comeback, but the words wouldn't form. His lips parted, then closed, the smirk that had once seemed unshakable now nothing more than a strained twitch. The mighty interrupter had been interrupted not by louder noise, but by unassailable truth. And in that instant, the hero and villain framing became undeniable. The bully who had thrived on shouting had been silenced, not by force, but by composure. The underdog, armed with nothing but preparation and conviction, had turned the tables in front of the entire nation. The chamber would not forget. The viewers at home would not forget. And Jim Jordan, for all his years of practiced domination, would never escape the image of that day, the moment when Jasmine Crockett's word struck like a gavel of justice, leaving him exposed before the world. And as the echo of her words spread, the fallout was just beginning. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words hit the air, the chamber itself trembled with silence, but outside those walls, the world erupted. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded social media timelines. The hashtags ignited like wildfire, hashtag Crockett vs. Jordan, hashtag legal ignorance, and hashtag mic drop moment trended simultaneously, each one feeding the digital frenzy. On Twitter, now X, the video looped endlessly, posted by activists, journalists, and everyday citizens alike. She destroyed him, one caption blared over a slow-motion replay of Jordan's stunned face. Another clip, paired with a popular hip-hop beat, cut between Jordan's sputtering words and Crockett's lethal precision. You don't confuse theater with jurisprudence. The meme culture went to work, crafting images of Jordan hiding behind stacks of law books he clearly hadn't read, while Crockett stood calm, gavel in hand like a superhero. Late-night talk shows wasted no time. One comedian opened with a biting line, "Jim Jordan just learned that yelling doesn't make you a lawyer." Jasmine Crockett gave him the courtroom education he never asked for. The audience roared, laughter mixing with applause as the clip played on giant screens. Another host quipped, "If I were Jordan, I'd call for a recess not in Congress, but in my career." Commentators across the political spectrum couldn't ignore the exchange. Progressive analysts hailed it as a watershed moment, proof that truth and composure still had a place in governance. This wasn't just a clapback, one op-ed declared. It was a masterclass in exposing the fragility of political theater. Even moderate voices noted how Crockett's dismantling resonated with the public's craving for accountability. Conservative pundits, meanwhile, fumbled for footing. Some dismissed it as a viral soundbite with no substance, but their strained tone betrayed discomfort. Others simply avoided the topic altogether, pretending as if it hadn't happened, a silence louder than any denial. In Jordan's own camp, the reaction was awkward at best. His allies offered muted statements, pivoting to unrelated issues or recycling old grievances. The bravado that once surrounded him seemed punctured, his reputation as a relentless bulldog suddenly tarnished by the image of him blinking, cornered, before Crockett's unwavering calm. Staffers scrambled to downplay the exchange, but their talking points couldn't match the tidal wave of online reaction. Meanwhile, Crockett's allies rallied with pride. Civil rights groups shared the clip as evidence of why representation mattered, why voices like hers were essential in halls of power. Grassroots organizations replayed her words at community events, framing her as a truth-teller who had stood her ground not just for herself, but for the millions watching who longed to see arrogance dismantled. The ripple effect grew. College students analyzed the moment in debate classes. Professors pointed to it as a living example of rhetoric triumphing over noise. Activists stitched the clip into larger narratives about justice, dignity, and the power of staying rooted in truth when confronted by bluster. And beyond the analysis, there was something simpler, something deeply human. People shared the video with captions like, "This gave me life today," or "I felt seen." Immigrants, women, and communities often talked over in public spaces recognized in Crockett's poise a reflection of their own struggles, the refusal to be silenced, the quiet strength of standing firm in the face of dismissal. In living rooms and on smartphones, viewers didn't just watch, they felt vindicated. For every time they had been interrupted, dismissed, or talked down to, Crockett's words carried their frustration, their longing for dignity, and their hope for fairness. This wasn't just politics. It was personal. Jordan's office attempted damage control, releasing a statement framing him as a victim of partisan theatrics. But the irony was too rich. Commenters dragged the statement online, highlighting how the king of bluster was suddenly crying foul about performance. Projection, "Thy name is Jordan," one viral tweet read, garnering hundreds of thousands of likes. By the end of the week, Crockett had become a symbol not just for progressives, but for anyone craving authenticity in a system saturated with noise. Interviews poured in, her words replayed in every segment, dissected with the reverence of a cultural turning point. What began as one exchange in a congressional chamber had become a story larger than the room, larger than the man who thought he controlled it. And yet, underneath the humor, the memes, and the applause, a deeper truth lingered. This wasn't just entertainment. It wasn't just a viral clip destined to fade with the next cycle of headlines. It was something more enduring, a reminder that arrogance is fragile, that truth can still cut through noise, and that dignity in governance is not a relic but a demand. But this wasn't just viral entertainment, it carried a deeper lesson. In the days after the clash, the noise of politics began to settle, but the image of Jasmine Crockett standing her ground lingered in the public imagination. For many, it was more than a fiery moment in a congressional hearing. It was a parable, a story about what happens when arrogance meets preparation, when bullying collides with calm resolve, when ignorance tries to disguise itself as authority and is stripped bare by truth. Crockett herself, in interviews and quiet reflections, never boasted. Instead, she reframed the confrontation with a clarity that cut deeper than any viral meme could. "It's not about who shouts the loudest," she said. "It's about who actually knows what they're talking about. The law isn't a weapon to intimidate. It's a tool to uphold justice." Those words resonated because they carried a universal truth: arrogance may make noise, but knowledge makes change. The broader moral was unmistakable. America has always wrestled with voices that seek to dominate by volume, by fear, by sheer force of personality. Yet its progress has always depended on the quieter, steadier forces of dignity, preparation, and truth. This hearing became a symbolic battleground for that eternal struggle. On one side stood the familiar tactics of interruption and intimidation. On the other, the timeless values of composure, knowledge, and integrity. And in that moment, dignity triumphed. For viewers who had grown weary of politics as performance, Crockett's composure felt like oxygen. It reminded them that there is still power in patience, that a steady voice can cut through chaos, that truth when spoken with confidence does not need to shout. The lesson extended far beyond Congress. In classrooms, workplaces, kitchens, and family tables across the country, people recognized a piece of their own lives in that exchange. They, too, had faced louder voices that sought to drown them out. They, too, had felt the weight of arrogance pressing down. And Crockett's example whispered back, "You can hold your ground. You can win without matching their noise." The clash also became a meditation on what it means to be American. Not in the narrow, exclusionary sense often pushed by those who conflate patriotism with power, but in the broader, truer sense, that America thrives when all its voices are heard, when justice outlasts bluster, when dignity silences ignorance. Crockett's stand was not just her victory, it was a collective one. It was proof that in the face of bullying, democracy still has defenders willing to fight with facts, not fists. As the clip continued to circulate, a pattern emerged. Parents showed it to their children as an example of courage. Teachers used it as a case study in debate and civics. Activists pointed to it as evidence that the fight for justice is not lost, that it lives on in every sharp rebuttal, every calm dismantling of falsehoods, every refusal to be silenced. The cinematic arc of this story closed not with shouting, but with silence, the silence that followed Crockett's words in that chamber. It was the silence of realization, the silence of a man left exposed, the silence of a room recalibrating its respect. And in that silence, something profound took root. This wasn't just a clash in Congress, one commentator wrote, it was proof that voices of truth can still break through the noise. That sentiment echoed across communities, reminding a weary public that the fight for justice is not measured in decibels, but in durability. And so the lesson endures, arrogance fades, noise collapses, but dignity rooted in truth stands tall. What Crockett delivered was more than a mic drop. It was a reminder of America's best self, a nation where knowledge outlasts ignorance, and where justice, though often tested, never disappears. Jim Jordan was silenced that day not by volume, not by interruption, but by truth itself. Jasmine Crockett's calm dismantling of his bluster wasn't just a sharp exchange in a congressional chamber, it was a revelation of what happens when arrogance collides with preparation, when noise is met with knowledge, and when intimidation is crushed by dignity. In a world where shouting often drowns out substance, her voice proved that composure carries more weight than chaos. She reminded us that the true measure of leadership isn't who talks the longest or the loudest, but who speaks with clarity, conviction, and courage. And in that moment, the moral clarity was undeniable: knowledge matters. Composure matters. Courage matters. But here's the truth: this story doesn't end in that chamber. It continues with all of us. Every share, every comment, every conversation sparked by this moment is part of building a culture where truth stands taller than arrogance. If you believe in elevating dignity over bluster, justice over performance, then this is your invitation: subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to a movement that refuses to be silenced. Because what happened wasn't just a victory for one congresswoman, it was a reminder for every American that democracy is stronger when we stand with truth. And in moments like these, democracy doesn't just survive, it thrives.